Welcome, everybody, to our National Disability Employment Awareness Month presentation. National Disability Employment Awareness Month is held each October to commemorate the many and varied contributions of people with disabilities. We are particularly proud of our diversity at UC San Diego and value the contributions of all employees. We want to give special recognition to individuals with disabilities during this time and also acknowledge our community for embracing them and creating a space for all. Our 2022 theme is disability, part of the equity equation. We have a strong workforce at UC San Diego that is the sum of many parts and perspectives. And this year's theme, disability, part of the equity equation, celebrates the essential role individuals with disabilities play in our workforce. Reflecting this year's theme, throughout the month, UC San Diego will be engaging in a variety of activities to educate the UC San Diego community on disability employment issues and its commitment to an inclusive work culture. UC San Diego serves more than 2,000 students, employees, and departments each year for accessibility matters, academic and workplace accommodations, and to provide training. Resources include the Office for Students with Disabilities, known as OSD, and Disability Counseling and Consulting, also known as DCC. Thank you for joining us today to hear Judy's story. I'd like to now welcome Frank Silva and Allison Satterlin, our moderators for today.
Thank you, Terry. Good morning and welcome, everybody. I am Frank Silva, Associate Vice Chancellor of the Office for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Thank you for inviting me and our Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs, Allison Satterlin, to moderate today's event. Celebrated activist, advocate, and author Judy Heumann joins us today to discuss her powerful book, Being Human, an unrepentant memoir of a disability rights activist. After experiencing ableism, exclusion, and bullying in her early childhood, Judy did not let the stigma she faced stop her from making a difference. Instead, she became a leader in the movement for disability rights and helped influence many of the accommodations we take for granted in today's world. In 1970, Judy founded Disabled in Action, an organization whose activism led to the implementation of things like curb ramps and accessible public transit, movie theaters, and retail entrances across New York City. Some of her most well-known achievements include advocacy efforts that shape legislation, such as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Section 504, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Judy's thoughtful, eye-opening book recounts her lifetime of activism, fighting for visibility, access, and justice for the disability community. From suing for her speech in a wheelchair in New York City to the historic weeks-long 504 sit-in at a federal building in San Francisco, Judy has worked for decades to demand meaningful changes that have improved the lives of people with disabilities. The Netflix documentary Crip Camp includes archival footage of landmark events discussed in the book, like demonstrations Judy led alongside friends she met at summer camp for teens with disabilities. The Oscar-nominated film tells the story of how the camp became the catalyst for the efforts of several of the most influential leaders in the disability movement today, including Judy. Reading her own take on those historic moments and seeing them on screen reminds us of the importance of community and solidarity in the fight for equal rights. This year's theme for National Disability Empowerment Awareness Month is disability, part of the equity equation. And Judy's work has shown that disability justice is an issue that affects all of us. Today, we are honored to be in conversation with her to discuss how one individual's passion can impact and inspire generations. Welcome, Judy.
Great to be with you all.
I thought we could start today with honoring your parents and their influence on you becoming an activist. In your book, you wrote, "My parents were thinkers. They had learned what happens when hatred and inhumanity are accepted. Both my father and mother were brave people who lived by their values. They had personally experienced what happens when an entire country chooses not to see something simply because it is not what they wish to see. As a result, they never accepted anything on face value. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about them and their influence on you growing up.
Sure, and thank you all very much for inviting me. And thank you, Frank, for your words. And I guess I always want to underscore the fact that what I hope people are getting out of the film and out of my book is that my story is my story. And it's very important that other people think about their stories and the ability for people to tell their stories. It's never one person who makes a movement. It wouldn't be a movement. And so I think that's really important, that one of the reasons I was happy to start working on this book was the fact that I think my story is valuable because it also helps other people think about their stories, and bringing all of our stories together is what I think really helps advance our rights and our parents. So, in the area of disability, you have those of us who had our disabilities when we were younger, at birth, or in my case, 18 months, or, before college. And parents frequently can play a very important role if their children are being discriminated against. In my case, when I had polio in 1949, I was 18 months old. My mom took me to school when I was 5 in the early 1950s. And there were no laws on the books that required disabled children to go to school and to have the same number of hours of education. So she didn't know that. My father didn't know that. No one had ever told them that. So we're German Jews, and my parents were sent out of Germany during the Holocaust, and my grandparents on both sides and other relatives were murdered in the concentration camps. So, they were stringing their life together after the war. And my mother, when she took me to school, and the principal said, "Oh no, I can't go to that school. I'm a fire hazard." She and my dad were really taken aback. So I think, they had to, before that point, because of other things that had happened, but certainly at that point, they really had to recognize that there was a lot more that they were going to need to do, although they didn't know what that would be or who they would work with, because not only weren't there laws on the books, but there were charities like the March of Dimes, which was working on a vaccine for polio, but there weren't like polio organizations that were fighting to get kids in school. So, my parents, and later I was on home instruction till I was 9. But when I started going to school, when I was 9, I went to classes only with other disabled children. And so my parents were meeting other parents who were also in the same struggle, getting their kids a decent education. And in the segregated classes that we went to, they were racially integrated, but the kids all had at least a physical disability, in some cases, physical and intellectual disability. And we couldn't walk steps. That's why we went to this particular school in the basement. It was a regular school. We didn't have lunch with the non-disabled kids. We didn't have gym or music or anything. Once a week, we went to the assembly together. So my mother learned with other mothers that we were not going to go onto high school. We were going to have to go back onto home instruction. So my mother organized with other parents and got the Board of Education to open up some schools, making them basically accessible. So all these things that I was learning from my mother and other mothers and fathers was very important. And I think today, when I speak to parents, I speak about the importance of the parents being strong and setting a good example for their children.
Thank you, Judy.
Judy, it's such a pleasure to get to spend time with you today and to get to do this alongside Frank and Terry. So Judy, in the first chapter of Being Human, you spoke of feeling like a burden, accepting that notion even, and reflecting on your time at camp. You wrote, "I didn't have to secretly rank what I needed in order of importance so as not to ask for too much at once." Tell us more about your experiencing asking for help and how or if you overcame that feeling that you are a burden.
I think this is a very important question. And let me put it also into context and say that today our system still fails to ensure that people with various forms of disabilities are able to get the support that we need to be able to do things that we would otherwise be able to do by ourselves if we didn't have our disabilities. Home and community-based services, personal assistance services, sign language interpreters, appropriate supports for people with intellectual disabilities, mental health disabilities, or learning disabilities, whatever it may be. When we can't come into a space and feel like the supports that we need or accommodations that we need are something that we can feel comfortable about discussing and not feel that we're being pushed back for what we need, that can make one feel like a burden or marginalized. I think when I was a child, you know, there were three of us, my mother, my father, and my two brothers and myself. And my mother was obviously, my dad was at work. He would leave like at 4 or 5 in the morning. He'd get home at 7, 8 at night. So my mother was the one that was getting us up in the morning, getting us ready for school and, you know, what other mothers were and still do. Some cases fathers, but typically mothers. And, you know, I could see that she had a lot of things to do. And so if I would have had someone that was supporting me other than my mother, I would have been able to do things that, for example, I talk about camp. And one of the issues at camp was I needed the same help at home as I did at camp. I needed help getting my braces on, getting bathed, getting dressed, picking out my clothes. But when I was at camp, the counselors were there in part to help me and others do those things that we couldn't do for ourselves. Now, we didn't have a one-on-one, so we were sharing people, but nonetheless, it was different. And so, you know, I have begun to think over the years about what was different. Well, my mother would come down in the morning to get me up, and she typically would not, "Oh, so what would you like to wear today?" You know, she was like, boom, 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 and she'd take things out that I wanted to wear. And if I didn't want to wear them, it was like, well, I don't really want to do that. I want to wear this. But if she was on to step 3 and I was still on step 1, I didn't necessarily get to wear what I wanted to wear. So the issue was, you know, at camp and other places, when I was able to begin to make choices. And that's what this is about, prioritizing time and things that I needed, which would enable me to feel like I was just an equal member in the community. And camp, I think, was a very important place because it allowed me to see not only that I could make choices, but because I could make choices, I had to begin to think about what choices did I want to make? You know, what did I want to do? What did I not want to do? How did I want to do it? And those are things for non-disabled kids also, you know, that you begin to make more advanced decisions. But, you know, moving forward as an adult, one of the reasons why it's so important that regardless of your disability, that you're able to get supports that you believe are essential to your functioning in an equal way in the environment that you're in. And there are different, as I've been saying, different supports that people may need. And the more people understand the value of the supports, which may be very little, okay, I'm going to go to an event. Do I go with somebody or not? It's the winter. I've got a coat on. Is there somebody I can feel comfortable asking to take off my coat? Or do I bring someone with me to help me take off my coat? How do I know if there's somebody where I'm going to be who will help me take off my coat without some weird vibe when I ask them to do it? There are little things like that, which can, of course, become much bigger when you're looking for a job on the whole issue, or when you're going to school. What kind of accommodations do you need? Answering those questions, really looking at a university, it's very important to see what do the disability services offices provide. Do they provide it in a way which is seamless, where people understand, I need extended time, or I need sign language interpreters, or I need captioning, or I need whatever it may be. The button for the electric door isn't working and it hasn't been working. Who's fixing it? The elevator, all these different things. Are you made to feel like a burden or a pain by saying, this can't be? If we're in a positive environment where we have the ability to both speak to people and to feel respected in what we're saying, that takes away this feeling of lack of equality and having to measure what can I ask for and when, because there are a number of things that I need, but I have to really prioritize. I'm not talking about frivolous things. I'm talking about issues that can be quite important for the individual's success in the community, in school, in the family, at work, wherever. But I think what's essential is really to be able to have meaningful discussions, so people can express how they believe things are going, what they believe needs to happen, improvement that's happened, and failures that still exist.
Thank you so much, Judy. Frank?
Judy, I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about your decision to fight the Board of Education for the right to obtain a teaching license in the state of New York. I can imagine that didn't come lightly. Could you share with our viewers and our listeners what led you to take such a step and file that lawsuit?
It's a great question. And, the long time ago, my recollection over those years is I knew, as the book explains, that it was very likely I was going to be denied my right to teach. And I knew that because friends of mine with disabilities who really didn't know more than I did, basically were saying, look around you. Do you see any other teachers who are using wheelchairs? And of course, the answer was a resounding no. And my friends were saying to me, look, don't tell, it's called the Department of Rehabilitation, that you want to be a teacher, because they're going to tell you no. Show me someone who has a job like you have at that point, or like you want. At that point, because there was no Section 504, there was no ADA, there were no laws like that. There wasn't an understanding that, well, yes, disabled people may have been denied the right to teach, but it's a violation of the law. So go ahead and, you'll have the law to protect you. That wasn't there at all. So, I was 18 years old, 17 years old when I went to college. As I mentioned before, my parents were immigrants. everyone on my father's side of the family were butchers. I wasn't going to become a butcher. My cousins and my brothers, they all either went into business or into teaching. And so my role models were pretty limited as far as people who actually had disabilities were concerned. I knew very few people. That's a whole other discussion. But even today, we see very few disabled people with, blindness, deafness, learning disabilities, physical disabilities, white, Black, Latino, Asian, gay, straight, whatever. We don't see a lot of ourselves in any jobs, in any meaningful place in society. As a rule, things are improving, more people are moving into jobs, but it's still more of an oddity. And so those were the images that I had. But I did, when I was like a freshman or a sophomore, call the American Civil Liberties Union. And I said, I want to be a teacher. I think I'm going to have trouble because blah, blah. And they said, well, take your coursework. And then if you have a problem, call us. So I was doing all the kinds of things that I felt I could do. I minored in education. As a minor, I never did classroom teaching. And there were a shortage of teachers at that time. So you could get a license with 12 credits, 3 courses. I did that. I worked with friends on an after-school program, working, with kids. So trying to get some experiences in teaching in alternative ways. And when I took in New York, you have to pass a written, oral, and a medical. I passed the written and the oral. They were all given in inaccessible buildings, like really inaccessible buildings. My friends carried me in and out of the buildings. And then I was failed on my medical exam. So the decision to sue, as you were asking, Frank, was really a difficult decision for a lot of reasons. I really didn't know any lawyers. I had one cousin who was a lawyer, but he was older. I never spoke to him about this. And I was very fortunate that a friend of mine in undergraduate school at Long Island University was doing some work at the New York Times and told the story of my being denied my teaching license. Malcolm Davis, I believe his name was, the reporter. And he wrote a story. And that story turned in the next day to be an editorial from the New York Times board. That in and of itself was something that was amazing. And then a lawyer called me after reading these articles, and he was interviewing me for a book that he was writing on civil rights and had never thought about disability from a civil rights perspective. Now, I was 21 or 22 at that point, and so it was a big thing of making it up as I went along. I mean, I was working with my friends. We had set up Disabled in Action in New York. We were a young activist organization, but I never knew anybody who sued anybody. And so I liked the guy, and I said at the end, would you represent me? Now that was, I think also, Frank, as you were saying, a really big step, because I was really fearful of what if I don't do a good job? If I am the first disabled person to teach and I don't do a good job, does that mean that that's another reason not to hire disabled people? I mean, I think many of us understand that when you are a minority in a group, there's more responsibility on your shoulders. Maybe people don't believe that, but I think many of us feel that we need to really do a good job, because we're not just there for ourselves. Now, whether that's true or not, I think that certainly was what I was feeling. And so it was a big decision. I did have support from my friends and family members, and we just went forward with it. And very fortunate to have had Constance Baker Motley as our judge. She was the first African-American woman to serve on any federal bench. And Justice Jackson referred to her in her testimony. And I think had it not been she who was the judge, the ruling might have been quite different. But, she understood discrimination on a more personal note. And I think that was very fortunate for us. I mean, on the face of it, it was ridiculous. But on the other hand, obviously, this was the New York City Board of Education. And I did call the ACLU back after I was denied my license, as they had said, and they refused to meet with me because they said, well, it's not discrimination. You were denied on for medical reason. So 50 years later, literally in 2021, I got an apology from the head of ACLU for what happened in 1971.
I'm happy to hear that you shared that. When I read that part of your book, I was incredibly surprised by their response. But at the same time, it really ties into some of the things that you put in your book about, especially what I read about the section about your parents. Like, when a nation chooses not to see something, that's what they choose to see. And your work has helped open the eyes of so many people over the years. So I just, so thank you. I found your book incredibly inspirational. I haven't finished it in full transparency, but I'm about halfway
Thank you.
through.
Well, I think, there are many people out there now who are writing. And what I believe is really also important, particularly when looking at universities, is we need to be looking at both disability studies, but we also need to be looking at how disability is being integrated into Black studies, Latino studies, queer studies, gender studies, because, we come from multiple backgrounds. And I think it's very important, I'm a disabled Jewish woman. And for me, in Jewish studies, it's very important to be looking at disability as a part of the issue. In women's studies, it's very important. But so many groups really have the same biases, prejudices, lack of awareness. And I believe that disability is unique in as much as anybody can acquire a disability temporarily or permanently. And this invisibility of who we are, I think also is one of the reasons why people are fearful. And I think gets to a question that Allison was asking earlier about issues of, being afraid of, being fearful of, needing to ask for help, as an example. If we had a system, little things like housing that's constructed being accessible. If all housing that was constructed was accessible, that would mean that a substantial number of people would not have to look at moving out of their homes to live in a more accessible place. If we were looking at the need for people who might need personal assistance services or sign language interpreters or services because you're blind or have a mental health disability or whatever it may be. And I want to really underscore that, well, I have a physical disability. I really try to emphasize the fact that we are a very broad community. And one of the things that's very important is that we recognize that our diversity is partly our strength, and that there needs to be a presumption that when we're talking as disabled people, we're really talking broadly, that we're really looking at making sure that individual people don't feel that they're not disabled enough to be able to identify as having a disability, or fearful with an invisible disability that if you disclose, it can have an adverse effect on entrance into school, advancement in a job, studying in certain fields, whatever it may be. getting married, whatever. I think that's the environment we're looking at changing, where everybody can feel respected and able to contribute regardless of the variations that we have within ourselves.
Agree. Intersectionality and representation really matter. Yeah,
And they enrich things.
definitely.
I think that's,
Thank you.
Judy, on the same theme of advocacy, can you walk us through the days leading up to the sit-in you coordinated in San Francisco regarding 504? What conversations were you having, and what was your goal?
well, here again, let me please underscore, it wasn't my goal, it was our goal. And let me give you a little bit of history. In 1972, then President Nixon vetoed the Rehabilitation Act. Inside that bill was something called Title V. Title V has a number of provisions that are anti-discrimination provisions, affirmative action provisions. And if you've seen Crip Camp, you'll see that in Crip Camp, there were demonstrations in New York City on Madison Avenue after President Nixon vetoed the bill. It was vetoed a couple of times, and then in 1973, it was finally signed. In Title V, there's one provision called Section 504, which actually everybody on a college campus should know about, in addition to the Americans with Disabilities Act, because the Section 504 says you may not discriminate against one based on disability if the entity is receiving money from the federal government. Basically, every university and community college, etc., in the United States receives federal money. Many different ways, but certainly student loans are one way. And once that law was signed into being, then something called regulations, the rules, the description of what the law is in greater detail, how it's going to be implemented, and what the responsible entities, in this case, entities that were getting money from the federal government, as well as disabled individuals, letting disabled people know this is what the law is, this is what the law isn't. If you believe you've been harmed, this is what you can do to file a complaint. So every educational institution around the United States since 1973 has been obligated to comply with the law. Now, between 1973 and 1977, these regulations were being developed. And we had been working, we as the disability community, I had moved from Brooklyn to Berkeley in 1973. I taught for 3 years after I won the lawsuit. And then in New York, you had to have a master's after 5 years. So I decided I would go to graduate school full time and came to Berkeley to do that. They also were setting up a group called the Center for Independent Living at that time. And I actually had been recruited by a gentleman named Ed Roberts, who was a disability rights leader in California. And so we at CIL began working with the government on the development of these rules. I then, as a part of graduate school, went and worked for U.S. Senator for 1.5 years. And in that time period, there was a national group called the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities, which unfortunately only lasted for about 7 years. But it was the first cross-disability led coalition of disabled people. And one of the reasons this coalition was established was to work on implementation of various laws, including getting the regulations for Section 504 signed, so that they would be basically the guidance and direction of how Section 504 would be implemented. So after all these years and meetings and discussions and draft regulations being sent out in through the Federal Register, where people commented on the proposed regulations and they were ready to be signed, but President Ford refused to sign them. When Jimmy Carter was running for president, he said that he would have them signed. Many of us worked on his campaign, and when he came into office, the person that had responsibility, the Secretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, then decided that he was not going to automatically sign these regulations. And that really was the impetus for the demonstrations. This was in February of 1977. ACCD passed a motion that said if the regulations were not signed by a specific date, there would be demonstrations around the country. And the reason was that we felt if we didn't demand that the regulations be signed as they were when Carter came into office, and there were compromises across the board made for these proposed regulations, that they would get watered down. And so ergo the demonstrations. But when we in San Francisco, and we were much more organized in the Bay Area than other parts of the country, realized that maybe we shouldn't be leaving the building. And there were just a handful of us that thought that way. And after a meeting with the regional director, who really knew nothing about what we were talking about, didn't know what 504 was, didn't know about the regulations, his staff knew nothing. We just said to everybody after this big rally, we really can't leave. We don't know what's going to happen. And it was really something that we did because it was so hard to get people together. And so here we had all these people together who were together for a mission. We all wanted these regulations signed. And so no one had planned for one night, let alone 26 or 27 nights. So it turns out that this was and still is the longest demonstration in a federal building in US history. Now, could this be done again today? Likely not because of security issues, but I think it was an amazingly empowering period of time because it was something where whether or not you were in the building or not, you had a stake in what was going on. There were demonstrations outside the building every day in support of what was happening. The media was giving it more coverage. About 24 of us went from California to join disabled people in Washington, D.C. with the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities and other groups. And so I would say that it was the first national activity that was led by disabled people with all types of disabilities from all backgrounds. And in the end, we were successful on getting the regulations signed as they were. I think that momentum really was the igniting force of what in 1990 became the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Judy, it's such a powerful reminder of what we can do in partnership and coalition. So thank you for that and providing the context. I'm going to turn it over to Frank as we start to pepper you with the questions that our colleagues who are joining us today would like us to offer as well. So Frank, back to you.
Thank you. Judy, I just wanted to say about you in your book, you were writing about I'll get to this question, but I just want to point out two things that I found really lovely in your description of that takeover in the days that you were there. There was one section in the book where you said, we realized they were trying to lock you guys, prevent communication to the outside. And you said, we realized we had a secret power or a secret weapon, and it was people who could sign. And when I read that, I was just, it put a huge smile on my face when I read that part. And the other part that I really, there's two other parts where they came in and tried to tell you that there was a bomb. And I think you said to them, wake me up in the morning or something like that. And
well, so this is what happened with the bomb scare. Remember, I mentioned that there were these demonstrations in New York City after Nixon vetoed the Rehab Act. we also went into Nixon headquarters. The first day of our demonstrations in New York was on a Thursday and the elections were on Tuesday. And a group of us went into the office and did a sit-in in the office. And they called in a bomb threat. And I remember at first we were like, oh, we better get out of here. And then some of us thought, well, you know what? None of the staff are leaving. So if there really is a bomb threat, why aren't they leaving? Because they could get out quicker than we could. So when that's what happened in the federal building, and it was a little different situation, which we learned later. But nonetheless, I think we were not going to allow anything to get us out of the building until we wanted to go. And I think we moved to another part of the hall while they were doing a sniff test to see if there were any bombs. But people were very committed. I mean, that was what was important. I think people really believed, and rightly so, that we could make a difference as we move forward, and that we were able to pull together a lot of diverse groups. You know, in the film, you see the Black Panthers who brought food every day, as did Safeway, as did interfaith groups, Glide Memorial Church, and others that, you know, some people here historically may know about from the Bay Area. But I think the most important thing is there was resolve. And in the end, it really did make a difference.
It did. So I'd love to get to some of the questions from the audience. The first one is, how did you manage organizing a movement while facing all other life challenges?
Well, first of all, it wasn't me, it was a group of us. And I want to really continue to underscore that. So we were very conscious in the Bay Area that the Berkeley Center for Independent Living would play a major role in this area. We had a policy project, and community organizing was something that we did on a regular basis. But there were a number of other centers for independent living in San Francisco, in Palo Alto, you know, in different areas. And we put together a committee, and the committee was made up of people from different organizations. And we invited others like labor unions and other groups to participate. We shared the work. Kitty Cohn, who you see in the film, and in something that the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, which is a group in the Bay Area, put out on 504's footage from the demonstrations themselves, separate from Crip Camp. Kitty was unfortunately passed away, an amazing spokesperson, a dynamic community organizer. She really gave breath and life to so many things. And Pat Wright, who was a critical part, Mary Lou Breslin, so many other people. So I think what was really important is that we all saw this as a pivotal opportunity. And as I keep saying, one that I think we really believed we could not just let go. And so other things really became secondary. You know, we felt that we needed to do this because it could be so instrumental. Not that we believed if the regulations were signed that things would change overnight, but we really believed that if we were able to get these regulations, which, as I said, were negotiated for 5 years, were not as strong as we would have liked them to be, but were a decent compromise, that we would lose so much ground. And I think that was really it. It was other life challenges. I don't want to say they were secondary, but we really believe that 504 could make a difference in other challenges that we were facing in life. So, you know, we worked around things. I think that's what civil rights movements, you know, whether whether it was the farm worker strikes that were going on, labor union issues, various and sundry other ongoing forms of discrimination. At some point, people say enough is enough, and you sacrifice certain things in order to be able to address the bigger issue. And I think that's clearly, what was happening. It wasn't something that happened in a minute. It was something that happened over years. And I think that was the power of what was and still goes on, is that we didn't want to be seen as failures. And I don't mean individually. I think we really felt that for the advancement of our movement, it was important that we do this. And then ultimately, individually, people would benefit. We also talked about this when we were doing media as something that wasn't just beneficial for disabled people today, but given how people acquire disabilities over the course of their life, we were helping people plan for their future, but then we were also looking at the issue of universality, right? So buses being accessible, trains being accessible, ramps being accessible, sign language interpreting, captioning, all various forms of interventions that help people with all types of disabilities. You may not have that disability today, but you may have a family member or a friend, or you may have it tomorrow, but we really spoke about how this was something that benefited the entire community. And I think we see that today. We see people completely expecting wider bathrooms, electric doors, captioning, Braille, accessibility in our technology. More and more people, recognize that this is beneficial for a much larger group.
Completely agree. Allison, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Frank. Judy, this is about the writing process from one of our colleagues who writes, I was really moved by the book and have a copy ready for my 9-year-old daughter to read. I was interested in learning how it was for Judy to write the book. Did it flow out as effortlessly as it read? How was it to look back, remember, and to share?
So the book was written by me and a woman named Kristen Joyner. And quite frankly, I never would have been able to do this book by myself. Many people had suggested that I write a book years earlier, and I never considered myself capable of doing something like this alone. And so I was really fortunate that, it's a society unfortunate, but I was working in the Obama administration and fully expecting that Mrs. Clinton was going to become the next president, and I was going to continue to work in the administration. That obviously did not happen. And then people approached me about whether or not I was interested in writing this book. And I was fortunate that there was an agent, and the agent said that they would help me find someone to write the book with. That's very common when books are written, but I was very lucky. I don't want to say lucky. When I met Kristen Joyner, we spoke on the phone, we met in person, and she doesn't have a disability, but I really liked her thinking, and I liked the fact that I felt I would be able to work with her and that she'd be able to listen to me. And so that's really a lot of what went on this book. It was very challenging in many ways because she was living in San Francisco and had a job in DC and came back and forth. Then she left that job. So, we had met a number of times in person. Then she was back in San Francisco, and then she moved to New Zealand. So we were writing this book very far apart. But I really, we really worked hard together because it was very important for me that my voice be the one that was driving this. And as I said in the very beginning, I really believe that stories are very important. And I wanted the stories to be as simple and clear as possible, that people could potentially, be in me as I was telling my story, that they could envision some way, some of these experiences. Not that they would be identical, but they could relate to other periods in their lives where things had happened. So we worked really, really hard on getting that right balance. And she's a great writer, obviously. And I learned to do a lot of editing. I also learned to speak up for myself because, it was difficult sometimes to come back a couple of times and say, no, this is not as I want it. These are the edits that I've made. She would come back and say, you need to understand, blah, 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 blah. So I really needed to learn. She needed to learn. So I think it was overall a good experience.
Thank you, Judy. Frank?
Judy, we have another question here. What do you think about amending the ADA to include aids at all places outside the home, grocery stores, banks, etc.?
Sorry. What do I think about what?
What do you think about amending the ADA to include aids at all places outside the home?
To include what?
AIDS.
AIDS?
Yeah, AIDS.
Personal
Oh,
aids,
personal
right?
assistance.
Personal assistance, yes.
Sorry. I would absolutely categorically not amend the ADA for that. That's not an ADA related issue, but let me quickly say, with the Supreme Court that we have today and with the Congress that we have today, looking at amending any civil rights law would be a disaster. I don't care if it's on disability, on race, gender, whatever. So to me, no, we are in no way, shape, or form in a position to amend any of these major laws without going down the toilet. But in response to your particular question, ADA has nothing to do with personal assistance. ADA is an anti-discrimination law, which means you apply for a job, you were denied, you believe it's because you had a disability. You can file a complaint. A new building was built with federal money, and they didn't make it accessible. Buses were bought, trains, blah, blah. You were not admitted into a program at the university because you're blind. All those things, and many, 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 many more examples, are what are covered by 504 and the Americans with Disabilities Act. But neither the ADA nor 504 have anything to do with money that's going to be utilized to pay for personal assistance services. So yes, we need to do much more. And one of the reasons why I'm so vehement and concerned about our elections this year is, you may remember last year in 2021, the president had something called Build Back Better legislation. There were $400 billion in the Build Back Better provisions for home and community-based services, only for people who are on Medicaid, but it would have gotten rid of the waiting lists. If those waiting lists would have been gotten rid of, then people who needed home and community-based services and met the income eligibility criteria would be able to get that. So again, this is not an ADA issue. This is a budget issue. This is an issue of state legislatures. There are many states in the United States, even with the ACA healthcare coverage, who have not been passing laws to allow people who could be eligible for Medicaid to get healthcare. So I think what I'm so concerned about is if we don't reelect the number of Democrats, and I'm not saying that everything they do is right, absolutely not, but I think we need to look at the records. When you look at the Republican record, what do you see? You see that if they got what they wanted, there would be no more ACA. They were trying to completely strip the law that was passed in 2010. I was speaking with people last week. Many of you may be aware of the fact that airline travel for people with disabilities has become quite problematic. 29 wheelchairs a day being severely damaged. So there are a number of organizations that are working on getting a piece of legislation introduced and passed that would protect disabled people and require airlines to do certain things. They have 54 sponsors, not one Republican, not one Republican. So I know the economy is an important issue. Obviously, it's important for everybody. But if we lose healthcare, if we lose people that are supporting, expanding the minimum wage, healthcare, unionizing, organizing, on, things are going to become much worse. I know we're finished.
Judy, I cannot believe how quickly the time passed this last hour. It seems impossible. And I imagine, along with my colleagues here and those who have joined us and others who may not have been able to be here today, would encourage us to invite you back, because I think we have just scratched the surface of your story and
Not
the
my
power.
story.
Our story. Thank you, Judy. And that is part of the lesson that you've been working to teach us today. So thank you so very much for that. We are absolutely humbled to have had this time with you. I want to thank you for joining us on behalf of the telling of our story, and want to thank you and others for the tireless advocacy and of course the authenticity that you shared today to make space for celebration and awareness and engagement around the importance of disability justice, not just in college and university campuses, but around the world. I want to thank all of the partners who joined us today and for the thoughtful questions that you submitted for Judy. I want to thank Frank for the opportunity to get to moderate this space with him, our partners in equity, diversity, and inclusion, and human resources, and the Dean of Undergraduate Education and Student Affairs for bringing this time together. And I would invite everyone to check out the disability awareness website that I believe will be shared by way of the chat or in some follow-up communication. And thank you so very much, Judy. And thanks to all of you for coming together today.